The hogs were digging for their lives. The baked red clay of the creek bed, which 18 months ago had been a slick, sucking mud, was now a mosaic of deep cracks wide enough to swallow a girl's ankle. August had arrived, like the open door of a furnace, and refused to close. The sun was a white fire in a bleached sky, and the air itself felt thin and brittle, as if it might shatter. In the town of promise, wells were going shallow, then dry. Corn withered on the stalk, its leaves rattling like paper ghosts. But here, in the basin of land everyone had called worthless, Elspeth's 4 massive hogs were not dying. They were digging, their broad, wet snouts, tough as old leather, pushed into the cracked floor of the dry creek, tossing aside plates of baked earth. They were not digging for water. They knew, with an animal certainty that superseded human hope, that there was none. They were digging for the cool, damp, blue-gray clay that lay 3 feet down. They coated themselves in it, a living armor against the heat that was killing everything else. Elspeth watched them from the shade of the one great oak the privet had never managed to strangle. Her hands, calloused and stained, were clenched at her sides. She was doing the arithmetic again. 4 hogs, 25 acres, 1 kiln, and a town's worth of desperation. The numbers spun in her head, a grim calculation of survival. The hogs were her miracle and her burden, the source of her strange salvation and the focus of the town's slowly curdling envy. They had unearthed her future, and now, it seemed, they were the only living things, besides herself, that knew how to endure the present. One person alone, that's what the auctioneer had called her, his voice slick with pity. One person alone against 25 acres of knotted, snarling, irredeemable privet. It had been a different world then. 18 months earlier, the land had been defined not by what it held, but by what it hid. The April day of the sheriff's sale was damp and cool, smelling of wet earth and new beginnings for everyone, but the unfortunate soul whose property was being auctioned on the courthouse steps. Elspeth stood at the back of the small crowd, a still figure in a worn but clean dress. She was 24 and possessed little more than a quiet stubbornness and the small inheritance her parents had left her. Money she'd guarded like a banked coal. The men of promise, farmers and merchants, stood with their hands in their pockets, shifting their weight and talking in low rumbles. They were here for the usable parcels, the cleared pasture land, the woodlots with good standing timber. They were not here for Lot 7. When the auctioneer, a man named Henderson with a florid face and a voice that could curdle milk, called out, "Lot 7, the old hemlock parcel," a collective sigh went through the crowd. A few men chuckled. 25 acres, more or less, Henderson droned, avoiding anyone's eye. Access from the old county road. As is. As is was doing a great deal of work. The hemlock parcel was a local joke. A green cage of invasive privet, so thick you couldn't walk 10 feet into it. It grew on a shallow basin of land that was too wet in the spring and too poor for corn in the summer. It was said to be riddled with poison ivy and snakes. "What am I bid for this fine piece of landscape?" Henderson asked, a smirk playing on his lips. Silence. A man in the front row called out, "I'll bid you $1 to burn it." Laughter rippled through the men. Elspeth's hands tightened on the worn fabric of her purse. She had walked the perimeter of that land. She had seen what they had not, or what they had chosen not to see. They saw a wall of green. She saw the way the water pooled and held in the basin long after other fields were dry. She saw the deepness of the shade. She saw potential, a different kind of potential than a cornfield offered. "Do I hear an opening bid?" Henderson asked, ready to move on. $10, Elspeth said. Her voice was clear and steady, but it cut through the murmuring quiet like a thrown stone. Every head turned. They looked at her, this young woman alone, and the looks ranged from surprise to outright pity. Henderson blinked. $10 from the lady. Do I hear 15? Silence. The men looked at each other, then back at her, shaking their heads. This was a fool's purchase, a woman's folly. 20, said a gruff voice. It was Jebediah Miller, who owned the adjoining pasture. He didn't want the land, but he didn't like the idea of an unknown quantity next to his fences. 25, Elspeth said immediately, without hesitation. Miller scowled. He wasn't going to throw away real money on a joke. 30, he grumbled, more out of pride than intent. 40, Elspeth said. Her voice was as calm as a settled pond. That was the end of it. The number was, to the men gathered there, both laughably small for 25 acres and absurdly large for this particular piece of it. Miller spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the grass and shook his head. "Let her have the briar patch," he muttered to his neighbor. "Sold," Henderson cried, banging his gavel with theatrical relief. To the young lady for $40, Elspeth stepped forward, counted out the worn bills and silver, and accepted the deed. She ignored the whispers, the soft chuckles, the looks that said she'd just bought herself a cage. She folded the paper, tucked it into her purse, and walked away from the courthouse, her face a mask of calm resolve. She walked the 2 miles out to her new property, her property, and stood before it. The wall of privet was even more formidable up close. A tangled, 30-foot-high mass of woody stems and dark green leaves that blotted out the sun. It smelled of damp rot and bitter vegetation. The town was right. It was impenetrable. But Elspeth wasn't planning on going through it. She was planning on going under it. The town of promise settled into its judgment of Elspeth Hale with a comfortable certainty. She had spent her meager inheritance on a patch of weeds. It was a tragedy, they said over coffee at the general store, but a predictable one. A young woman alone, with no man to guide her, was bound to make such mistakes. They watched as she spent another few dollars on 4 young pigs at the livestock market, and the judgment turned to mockery. "Gonna fatten 'em on privet leaves?" one farmer had joked, loud enough for her to hear. Elspeth had simply paid the man, loaded the squealing pigs into a borrowed crate, and hauled them to her land. She had a small, dilapidated cabin on the property's edge, barely more than a shed, which she repaired with dogged patience. She fixed the roof, chinked the walls, and built a sturdy pen for the hogs. Then she opened the gate, not onto the road or a patch of grass, but directly into the face of the privet jungle. For the first week, the hogs did what hogs do. They rooted in the soft dirt at the edge of the thicket, ate the feed she gave them, and wallowed in a muddy puddle she kept filled with buckets of water hauled from a neighbor's well nearly a mile away. The neighbor, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, charged her a penny a bucket. The arithmetic was brutal, but Elspeth was patient. She knew, from books she'd read at the library in the county seat, that privet roots were shallow and that hogs were living plows. On the 8th day, a big-shouldered sow she'd privately named Patience, driven by a relentless appetite for roots and grubs, shouldered her way into the undergrowth. The other 3 followed. From her cabin, Elspeth could hear them, the snapping of branches, the contented grunts, the steady, tireless churning of the forest floor. Day after day, the hogs worked. They were not clearing the land in the human sense. They were eating it. They devoured the tender roots, stripped the low-hanging leaves, and their sharp hooves churned the soil, uprooting the smaller bushes. They were a slow, methodical, organic engine of destruction. It was on a Sunday afternoon in late June when she had her first visitor. An old man, walking the dusty road with a slight limp, stopped and leaned against her fence. He was tall and thin, with a cloud of white hair and eyes the color of a faded summer sky. He watched the hogs, who had by now cleared a space the size of a good-sized parlor, for a long time. Elspeth, wary of more mockery, came out of her cabin and stood by the gate. The man turned to her, and his face was not mocking. It was curious. "They work hard, your pigs," he said. His voice was gentle, with the lilting accent of the old country. He was Mr. Abramowitz, a Polish immigrant who had a small farmstead on the other side of town. He was known for being quiet and keeping to himself. "They earn their keep," Elspeth replied, her voice guarded. He pointed with a long, bony finger at the soil the hogs had turned over. It wasn't the thin, rocky loam of the surrounding farms. It was darker, denser. Where the pigs had dug deep was a strange bluish-gray color. "You see the soil?" he asked. Elspeth nodded. She had been watching it, crumbling it in her fingers every morning. It had a fine, almost greasy texture when damp. "They are good farmers," Mr. Abramowitz said, his eyes twinkling. He looked from the soil to the impenetrable wall of green, then back to her. He saw not a fool, but a strategist. He smiled, a slow, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "My grandfather, back in the old country," he used to say, "Ziemia pamięta tu, o czym ludzie zapominają." He saw her confusion. "It means, the land remembers what people forget." He tapped the fence post. "This land has not been plowed in 100 years. People forget what is under the weeds, but the land, it remembers." He nodded to her, a gesture of profound respect, and continued his slow walk down the road. Elspeth stood there long after he was gone, the Polish words echoing in her mind. The land remembers. She looked at her four grunting, muddy architects of change, and for the first time felt the solid weight of a secret hope. The hogs were relentless. By August, they had cleared a full acre. It was not a pretty sight. The ground was a chaotic landscape of churned earth, shredded roots, and the skeletal remains of larger privet bushes the hogs couldn't uproot. But it was clear. Sunlight, for the first time in decades, reached the soil. Elspeth worked behind the hogs, gathering the larger stalks and piling them to dry for firewood. It was back-breaking labor, but it was progress. She felt like a general following her shock troops, consolidating their gains. The arithmetic was improving. She no longer had to haul as much water. A small spring had reappeared in the cleared area, one the privet had been drinking dry. The hogs found it first, of course. One morning she saw them wallowing in a fresh mud slick she hadn't created. She dug around it with a shovel and soon had a small, steady pool of clean, cold water. The penny per bucket expense vanished from her ledger. The discovery that would change everything came on a sweltering afternoon. The air was thick and still. Elspeth was gathering wood when she noticed Patience, the big sow, behaving strangely. She wasn't rooting for food. She was digging with a frantic, focused intensity in one spot, snorting and tossing clumps of the deep, blue-gray clay over her shoulders. Curious, Elspeth approached. As she got closer, she heard a sound she didn't recognize. A dull, rhythmic clink, clink, with every push of the sow's powerful snout. "What have you got, girl?" she murmured. She nudged the hog aside. Patience grunted in protest, but ambled off to join the others. Elspeth knelt. The hole the sow had dug was nearly 3 feet deep. At the bottom, something was catching the light. She reached in, her fingers sinking into the cool, damp clay. She felt something hard, flat, and unnaturally smooth. She began to dig with her hands, scraping away the heavy soil. The object was red, brick. She cleared more space, her heart starting to beat a little faster. It wasn't just one brick. It was a course of bricks, laid in a gentle, perfect curve. She scrambled back to her cabin for a shovel and began to dig in earnest, the sun beating down on her back. The curve continued, sweeping downward into the earth. She dug for an hour, then 2, her dress soaked with sweat, her muscles screaming. She was uncovering a structure, a dome. It was a large, bottle-shaped kiln, built of old, dark red brick, half buried like the shell of some ancient, giant creature. The firing chamber was below, and the chimney, or what was left of it, had long ago crumbled, but the main dome was almost perfectly intact, preserved by the heavy clay that had entombed it. She sat back on her heels, covered in mud and sweat, and stared. A kiln, a potter's kiln, on land no one wanted. She thought of Mr. Abramowitz's words. The land remembers what people forget. People had forgotten a potter had once worked here. They had forgotten the fine clay that drew him. The privet had grown over his life's work, hiding it, and in a way, protecting it. Elspeth looked around at the acres of churned earth, at the blue-gray soil exposed everywhere. This wasn't just land, it was a quarry. She stood up and walked to the edge of the clearing, looking out at the road. She saw no one. The secret was hers. She would keep it like a coal, banked low under ash, waiting for the right moment to give it air. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat at her small table, the ledger open, but she wasn't doing arithmetic. She was dreaming. A different kind of number filled her head. The firing temperature of clay, the price of glaze, the number of pots she could fit in a single firing. The town of promise could keep its judgment. She had 25 acres of clay and a kiln to fire it in. She had work to do. The next morning, Elspeth wrapped a hefty, 2-pound lump of the blue-gray clay in a damp cloth, put it in a basket, and walked the 4 miles to Mr. Abramowitz's farm. She found him in his barn, mending a piece of harness. The barn smelled of hay and old leather and something else, the dusty, mineral smell of dry clay. In the corner stood a potter's wheel and shelves lined with simple, sturdy earthenware crocks and bowls. Elspeth had found her expert. She held out the lump of clay without a word. He put down the harness, wiped his hands on his trousers, and took it. He broke a piece off, raised it to his nose, and inhaled deeply, his eyes closed. He crumbled it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its texture. Then he walked to a bucket of water, sprinkled a few drops onto a small piece, and began to work it in his palm. He did this for 5 minutes, his face a mask of concentration. Finally, he looked at her, and his faded blue eyes were bright with a profound, almost holy respect. "Where?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. "My land," Elspeth said. "The Hogs found it. There's a kiln, too, buried." A slow smile spread across his face. "Of course," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Of course. This clay. This is potter's clay. The old kind, full of life." He handed the worked piece back to her. It was smooth, plastic, and held its shape perfectly. "You must learn," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. And so her education began. Twice a week, Elspeth would walk to Mr. Abramowitz's farm. He was a patient, methodical teacher. He taught her how to wedge the clay, slapping and turning it on a thick wooden board to force out the air bubbles. "Air is the enemy," he'd say. "In the fire, it becomes a bomb. You must show the clay who is boss." He taught her how to center the clay on the wheel, a task that seemed impossible. Her first attempts were maddening. The lump of clay would wobble, resist, and then fly off the wheel entirely, splattering against the wall. Elspeth's jaw would tighten, but Mr. Abramowitz would just chuckle softly. "Is stubborn, no? Like a mule. You must be more stubborn." He taught her with his hands, placing his own weathered ones over hers, guiding the pressure, showing her how to feel the center, how to coax the walls upward with a steady, gentle strength. While she worked, a new figure began to appear at the edges of her property. A boy of about 12 named Silas, from a hard-luck family that lived in a shack down the road. He was thin and quiet, with eyes that saw everything. He was drawn by the hogs. He'd stand by the fence for hours, watching them. Elspeth, remembering her own solitary youth, didn't shoo him away. One day, she was hauling a bucket of slop to the pen. "Want to help?" she asked. Silas just nodded, his eyes wide. He took the bucket, his thin arms straining, and carefully poured it into the trough. He began showing up every day after that. He didn't talk much, but he worked. He helped mend the fence, haul water, and chop the privet stalks. He gave the hogs names beyond patience. There was a scrappy boar he called General, a smaller sow called Daisy, and a goofy-looking one he named Mud Pie. They were the first things he had ever been allowed to name, the first things that felt like his. He was there the day Elspeth brought her first wobbly, misshapen pots back from Mr. Abramowitz's. They were thick-walled and uneven, but they were pots. Silas touched one with a kind of reverence. "You made that?" he whispered. "I did," Elspeth said, a flicker of pride warming her. "Mr. Abramowitz is teaching me." She had a plan. She would practice on his wheel until her hands knew the way, and then she would repair her own kiln. Silas looked from the lumpy pot to the vast, cleared field of clay, then to the hogs, contentedly sleeping in a muddy heap. He didn't see a briar patch or a woman's folly. He saw a world being built from scratch, and for the first time in his life, he wanted to be part of building something. By the time the first snows fell, the rhythm of Elspeth's life had settled. Mornings were for the hogs and the land, clearing and consolidating. Afternoons were for the clay, practicing on a rickety wheel she and Mr. Abramowitz had built from a wagon axle and scrap lumber. Evenings were for the arithmetic, but now the numbers were tinged with hope. Silas was a permanent fixture, his quiet companionship a balm against the loneliness she rarely admitted to herself. He was learning too, his small hands, surprisingly adept at wedging the clay. The town's mockery had faded into a kind of baffled silence. They saw the smoke from her chimney, the ever-expanding clearing, but they couldn't make sense of it. The narrative of the foolish woman had been complicated by the evidence of her unceasing labor. Spring arrived, and with it, a new phase. It was time to excavate and repair the kiln. It was a monumental task. She and Silas, with occasional guidance from Mr. Abramowitz, spent weeks digging out the firing chamber, clearing the flue, and inspecting the brickwork. The old potter had built it to last. Only the firebox and the chimney needed significant repair. They used clay from her land, mixed with sand, to make new bricks and mortar, leaving them to bake in the sun. It was slow, ancient work. By May, it was ready. Elspeth had spent the winter making pots, her skill growing with every one. She now had a collection of 50 pieces, sturdy jugs, wide-mouthed crocks, and simple bowls. They were not elegant. They were plain, heavy, and a muted gray color, the natural shade of the fired clay, but they were strong. She and Silas carefully stacked them inside the kiln, a three-dimensional puzzle of potential. The first firing was a terrifying act of faith. She fed the firebox with dry privet stalks for 2 full days, slowly raising the temperature. The kiln drank the wood, glowing with a low heat. Smoke, thick and white, then thin and blue, poured from the newly repaired chimney. The town noticed. "What's she burning now?" Jebediah Miller asked at the general store. "The whole worthless place, I hope," someone else grumbled. Elspeth and Silas sat up all night with it, feeding the fire, watching the color of the glow through the spy hole change from red to a bright, fierce orange-yellow. Then came the slow, agonizing process of letting it cool for 3 more days. When she finally unbricked the opening, her heart was in her throat. She reached in and pulled out the first piece, a small jug. It was warm to the touch. She tapped it with her knuckle. It rang with a clear, high note. It had worked. All but 3 pieces had survived the trial by fire. They were no longer gray clay. They were stone. They were permanent. Her first market day was a quiet humiliation. She set up a small table, her 50 pots arranged neatly. People walked by, glanced at the plain, heavy-looking ware, and kept walking. They were used to the cheap, tin-glazed pottery from the big factories, decorated with cheerful flowers. Hers looked like something dug from the earth, which of course it was. "Too plain," one woman sniffed. "How much for that jug?" a farmer asked. When Elspeth told him the price, a fair price based on her labor, he scoffed. "I can get a tin bucket for half that." She sold 2 bowls all day, for a total of 10 cents. As she was packing up, a man in a crisp suit approached her stall. He had a clipboard and an air of officious boredom. "Elspeth Hale?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm Arthur Dade, the county tax assessor." He glanced at her unsold pots, at her worn dress, and at the expanse of her land visible in the distance. "Just doing the rounds. Your parcel, Lot 7, is assessed at a value of $40. The annual tax is negligible, but it must be paid." He made a note on his clipboard. "Still appears to be unimproved land, mostly. Just paying your dues on this thicket, ma'am." His tone was dismissive, condescending. He saw a woman failing at a foolish dream. He did not see the kiln. He did not know about the clay. He saw a worthless briar patch, and his assessment reflected that. It was a blessing, for now. It kept her taxes low. But as he walked away, Elspeth felt a chill. His eyes had a cold, calculating quality. He was a man who saw everything in terms of numbers on a ledger, and she knew, with a sudden, sharp certainty, that their business was not finished. Elspeth knew the local market was a dead end. Her pottery wasn't pretty, and Promise was a town that valued appearance over substance. Her pots were about substance. They were about heft and permanence. They were tools. She needed a buyer who understood tools. She had heard talk of the new railroad hotel that had opened in Clarion, the county seat 30 miles away. It was a grand affair, meant to impress travelers from the east. Grand hotels had grand kitchens, and grand kitchens had chefs who cared about function. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. She chose her 12 best pieces, 4 one-gallon jugs, 4 two-gallon crocks, and 4 heavy mixing bowls. Each one was a testament to her growing skill. They were still plain, but their lines were clean and confident. She wrapped them carefully in straw, loaded them into a hired cart, and made the day-long journey to Clarion. The back of the Clarion Grand Hotel was a whirlwind of noise and steam. Elspeth, feeling small and dusty, asked for the head chef. A moment later, a terrifyingly large man in a white apron, his face flushed from the heat of the stoves, emerged. He had a French accent and an expression of profound impatience. "Qu'est-ce que c'est? What is this?" he demanded, waving a hand at her cart. "I brought pottery," Elspeth said, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. "For your kitchen." The chef, whose name was Monsieur Dubois, laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Pottery? I have the finest from Ohio, from England. Go away, little girl." "Mine is better," Elspeth said. The quiet certainty in her voice made him pause. "Better? It is mud from a ditch, no? It's strong," she said. "It holds water without weeping. It will not crack when a hot ladle is dropped in it. It will outlast your Ohio pottery by 20 years. She unwrapped one of the jugs. She held it out to him. Annoyed, but intrigued by her nerve, he took it. His entire demeanor changed. His big hands, so used to judging weight and quality, closed around the jug. He felt its balance. He noted the thickness of the walls, the way the handle was joined to the body, not as an afterthought, but as an integral part of the whole. He turned it over, inspecting the unglazed bottom. He tapped it with a thick knuckle. It made that clear, satisfying bell tone. He looked from the jug to Elspeth. His eyes narrowed. He saw her calloused hands. The clay worked deep into the lines of her skin. This was not a merchant. This was the maker. "You made this?" he asked, his accent less pronounced. "Yes." "From what clay?" "From my own land." He was silent for a long moment. He set the jug down and picked up one of the crocks, then a bowl. He was judging them not on their beauty, but on their integrity. He was seeing the work. "You have more?" he asked finally. "This is what I brought today. I can make more." "How many of these jugs can you make me in 1 month?" 30, she said, her heart pounding. The arithmetic spun in her head. 1 firing, a full kiln, and the crocks, 20. Monsieur Dubois nodded, a short, sharp gesture. "I will buy all of this." He named a price that made Elspeth's breath catch in her throat. It was more than 10 times what she could have hoped for at the Promise Market. "And I will buy what you can make, every month. But the quality must stay the same. You understand?" "I understand," she said. She returned to Promise with an empty cart and a purse heavy with real money. The first thing she did was stop at the general store and buy things she had only dreamed of. A side of bacon, a sack of real flour, new boots for Silas, and a small bag of peppermint candies. The storekeeper, who had been part of the chorus of mockers, watched her count out the coins with wide eyes. The whispers started before she had even left the store. Where did Elspeth Hale get that kind of money? The story of her failed market day was well known. The sight of her prosperity, so soon after her public failure, did not compute. Mockery began to curdle into a suspicious, resentful curiosity. Something was happening out on that worthless patch of land, something they didn't understand. And in a town like Promise, what people didn't understand, they began to fear. The new year turned. and the land grew thirsty. The winter had been unsettlingly mild, with more dust than snow. The spring rains, usually a week-long affair that turned the roads to impassable mud, came as a few scattered, apologetic showers. By May, the farmers were looking at the sky with a worried squint. By June, the squint had become a fixed expression of dread. The sky was no longer blue. It was a pale, hazy, unforgiving white. The sun beat down with a personal malevolence. The creeks shrank from their banks, leaving belts of cracked, drying mud. The corn in the fields, which should have been waist-high, was stunted and yellowing. Hunger changes a town. It is a slow, creeping acid that dissolves old certainties. The easy camaraderie of the general store porch evaporated, replaced by tense conversations about the depth of wells and the price of feed. The laughter lines around men's eyes seemed to deepen into furrows of anxiety. Pride, which had been the town's most abundant crop, began to wither. Farmers who had laughed at Elspeth's privet patch now stood at the edge of their own fields, the soil as hard and useless as paving stones, and said nothing at all. But on Elspeth's land, a different story was unfolding. The deep basin of blue-gray clay, which had been a curse for farmers wanting drainage, was now a blessing. It held the winter moisture deep within it, like a vast, subterranean sponge. The remaining stands of privet, which she had left uncleared on the western edge of the property, acted as a windbreak and cast long shadows, slowing evaporation. Her small vegetable garden, planted in soil heavily amended with the rich topsoil the hogs had churned, was shockingly green. Her spring, the one the hogs had found, still trickled, fed by the deep reserves of the clay, and the hogs themselves were thriving. They spent their days in the cool, damp mud at the bottom of the excavated clay pit, emerging only for food. The drought that was strangling the town of promise was, for Elspeth, a proving ground. Her foolish purchase, her ridiculous methods, they had all been perfectly adapted for scarcity. She kept working. The monthly orders from Monsieur Dubois were her lifeline. Every 4 weeks, she and Silas would load the cart and make the long journey to Clarion. The money gave her a security she had never known. She paid Silas a real wage, and the boy, for the first time, was able to contribute to his own family's meager larder. He grew taller, his shoulders broadened, and the haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a quiet confidence. He was a potter's apprentice now, and he had a future. The smoke from her kiln, rising every few weeks into the clear, dry air, was no longer a subject for jokes. It was a mystery. It was a sign of industry in a landscape of failure. People started to ride out on the county road, stopping to stare at the impossible green of her garden, at the healthy-looking hogs, at the neat stacks of firewood. They saw the ever-growing pit of blue clay and the shelves of finished pottery she now kept in a small, newly built shed. They didn't understand how, and their bewilderment was slowly, inexorably, turning into a raw, desperate need. The fortune inversion was nearly complete. The thing that had looked worthless was proving to be the only thing of value. The woman they had pitied was becoming the one person they might have to depend on. It was a truth too bitter for most of them to swallow, but the dry dust in their throats was a constant, rasping reminder. The drought tightened its grip like a fist. By the first week of September, the river was the only source of water for miles, and it was a shrunken, sluggish version of its former self. Hauling water became the central, all-consuming task of every family. But hauling it was only half the problem. Storing it was the other. Wooden barrels, dried by the relentless heat, shrank and leaked. The few glass jars people owned were precious, reserved for canning the last of the garden vegetables. What the town of Promise needed, with a desperation that bordered on panic, was stoneware. They needed non-porous, reliable, earthen vessels. They needed jugs and crocks. They needed Elspeth's ugly, beautiful pottery. The first to come was Jebediah Miller's wife, her face a mask of strained pride. She, who had watched her husband mock Elspeth at the auction, now stood at Elspeth's gate, her hands twisting in her apron. My well is dry, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I need a jug to keep water for the children. She expected to be turned away. She expected scorn. Instead, Elspeth simply nodded, led her to the shed, and let her pick out a 2-gallon jug. Soon, others followed. The same farmers and townsfolk who had laughed at her now came to her door, their eyes downcast, their voices rough with shame and thirst. The arithmetic had inverted completely. Scarcity had made her work not just valuable, but vital. She could have named any price. She could have demanded apologies. She could have extracted a satisfying revenge for every slight, every chuckle, every pitying look. But Elspeth's character, like her pottery, had been fired in its own quiet kiln. It had been hardened into something strong and unyielding. The crisis was not an opportunity for profit. It was a responsibility. It was then that Mr. Dade, the tax assessor, returned. He did not come in his crisp suit and polished shoes. He arrived on horseback, looking grim and purposeful. He had heard the stories. He had put together the smoke from the kiln, the rumors of clarion money, and the town's new, desperate dependence. He saw an opportunity. "Miss Hale," he said, dismounting. His voice had lost its condescending warmth. It was flat and cold. "We have a problem." He held out a ledger. "It has come to the county's attention that you are operating a commercial enterprise on this land, a pottery." "I am," Elspeth said calmly. "This land was assessed as unimproved scrubland, valued at $40, Dade continued, his voice hardening. "But a producing clay quarry and a commercial kiln represent a significant increase in value, a radical increase." He flipped a page in his ledger. "By my calculation, based on estimated production and market value, the proper assessed value of this property is closer to $2,000. Elspeth felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "And based on that valuation," Dade said, his eyes glittering, "you are in arrears on your property taxes to the sum of $180, payable immediately." It was a death sentence. She had money from Monsieur Dubois, but nowhere near that amount. It was a lie, a fabrication built on greed. But he held the authority of the county. He knew she couldn't pay. This was the trap. "Of course," Dade said, his voice softening into a false sympathy. "It is a terrible burden in these hard times. The county is prepared to be lenient. As an alternative to seizure, we will buy the land from you. To clear the debt, we will offer you $100. A generous offer for a woman in your position. $100 for the land, the kiln, the clay, her entire future. He would take it all, and the law would be on his side. You have 24 hours to decide, Miss Hale," he said, climbing back onto his horse. "The sheriff will be here with the papers tomorrow at noon." He looked at the line of thirsty townspeople waiting by her gate, at the kiln, at the stacks of pots. He was not just seizing land, he was seizing the town's only hope. And he smiled. The news of Dade's ultimatum spread through the town like a grass fire. For Elspeth, the night was long and sleepless. She sat with her own ledger, the real one, its neat columns of income and expenses a testament to her honest labor. The numbers were clear. Dade's assessment was a fiction, a cudgel designed to break her. She could run. She could take the money she had and disappear. Or she could stay and fight, and almost certainly lose everything. One person alone. The auctioneer's words came back to her, no longer as an observation, but as a challenge. The next morning she did not pack, she did not hide. She opened her shed. The line of neighbors was already there, longer than the day before. They looked at her with a new expression in their eyes, not just need, but a shared fear. They knew if Dade took the kiln, the pottery would stop, or the price would become impossible. Her fate was now tied to theirs. "I need 2 jugs, Elspeth," a farmer named Cole said, his voice heavy. "What's the price?" Everyone leaned in. This was the moment. She held their survival in her hands. She looked at their sun-cracked faces, at the worry etched around their eyes. She thought of the mockery, the laughter, Then she thought of Mr. Abramowitz's kindness, of Silas's loyalty, of the simple, profound satisfaction of pulling a warm, perfect pot from the kiln. "A jug is a day's work," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I won't profit from a drought. The price is what it has always been, enough to pay for the wood and my time, 50 cents a jug." A wave of stunned silence, then profound relief, washed over the small crowd. Jebediah Miller, the man who had bid against her out of pride, took off his hat. That's more than fair," he stammered. It was an apology and a pledge of allegiance in one. At noon, Dade arrived as promised, the county sheriff at his side. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. He was a town man, and he could feel the shift in the wind. The crowd of townspeople did not disperse. They stood, holding their new, empty jugs, forming a silent, stubborn wall between Dade and Elspeth's cabin. "Well, Miss Hale," Dade said, dismounting with a flourish, "have you made your decision? The deed of sale or the notice of seizure?" "Neither," Elspeth said. She stepped forward, holding her own ledger. "Your assessment is fraudulent." Dade laughed. "A bold claim from an indebted woman. Sheriff, give her the papers." Before the sheriff could move, a voice piped up. It was Silas. He stood beside Elspeth, small but unbowed. "She's been providing for the whole town," he said, his voice ringing with indignation. "With these," Jebediah Miller said, holding up his jug, "water for our children at a fair price." Mr. Abramowitz, who had walked all the way from his farm, stepped forward. He looked not at Elspeth, but at Dade. "You are the county assessor, Mr. Dade. You assess value, yes?" "That is my job," Dade snapped. "You assess this land as worthless," Abramowitz said, his voice gentle but carrying. "And you were wrong. A thing is not worth what you say it is. A thing is worth what it does. And this land, this clay, this woman, they are saving this town. How do you assess the value of that?" Dade's face flushed with anger. "This is not a debate. It is the law." "Is it?" Elspeth said. She held up her ledger. "Here is every pot I have sold, every penny I have earned, the price I charge Monsieur Dubois in Clarion, and the price I charge my neighbors. The numbers are honest. Show me yours." She looked at the sheriff. How did he know to assess the value of a private contract with a hotel in Clarion? How did he know the exact number of pots in my monthly shipment? I never told him. A murmur went through the crowd. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, looking at Dade. It was a good question. Dade had overplayed his hand, his greed revealing his methods. He had been spying, extorting, using privileged information for personal gain. His authority crumbled into simple, ugly avarice. He was exposed, not by a lawyer, but by plain truth and a woman who refused to break. The sheriff looked from Dade's furious face to the calm, determined face of Elspeth Hale, and then to the faces of his neighbors, all watching him. He was the law, but the town was the town. He slowly shook his head. "This seems like a matter for a judge, Mr. Dade, not for a seizure on the spot. I'll not be a party to it today." Dade stared, his mouth opening and closing. He had been outwitted, shamed. He snatched the reins of his horse, shot a look of pure venom at Elspeth, and rode away in a cloud of dust, defeated. Elspeth stood, her ledger in her hand, surrounded not by a crowd of mockers, but by a community. She was not one person alone, not anymore. The drought broke in October, with a long, soaking rain that felt like a benediction. The land drank deeply, and the world turned green again. But the town of promise was not the same. The hard season had scoured away its arrogance, leaving something humbler and more resilient in its place. Elspeth's kiln became a quiet center of the local economy. Her pottery, once scorned, was now a staple in every household, a symbol of shared hardship and survival. Mr. Dade was removed from his post after Monsieur Dubois, upon hearing the story from Elspeth, wrote a scathing letter to the county magistrate detailing Dade's attempts to interfere with their contract. He was a man who appreciated integrity, in pots and in people. Elspeth's life found a new, steady rhythm. The orders from Clarion continued, providing a stable income, but she always set aside a portion of each firing for her neighbors, the price always remaining fair. Silas was now her full partner, his hands sure on the wheel, his mind quick with the chemistry of glazes they were beginning to experiment with, derived from wood ash and ground rock. He was no longer the town's lost boy. He was a craftsman. The Hogs, the architects of it all, grew fat and contented in their ever-expanding domain. They still dug, not for their lives now, but for the sheer joy of it, their broad snouts turning over the rich, dark soil, uncovering new pockets of the endless blue-gray clay. One cool evening in the following spring, Elspeth stood by the kiln as it cooled. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Mr. Abramowitz was with her, sitting on a log, smoking his pipe. They had just finished a community firing, where several of the local farmers' sons, under Silas's tutelage, had fired their own first clumsy pots. "You have taught them well," Mr. Abramowitz said, his voice content. "You have taught them the value of what is beneath their feet." Elspeth looked out over her land. The privet was gone, replaced by neat rows of vegetables, a paddock for a milk cow she had bought, and the great tranquil pit of clay. The ugly, impenetrable jungle had become a place of order, peace, and abundance. She thought of the auction, of the pitying looks, of the $40 that had felt like her last hope in the world. She ran a hand over the warm brick of the kiln, the heart of her homestead. She looked at the rich, gray clay dust on her fingers, the same color as the soil the Hogs had first shown her. "The land remembers what people forget," he had told her, "and sometimes, if you are patient enough, it teaches you to remember too." She was no longer just Elspeth Hale, the woman who bought the briar patch. She was the woman who listened to the land, and it had given her everything.